Quentin asked me to send him an abstract a few days ago, so I wrote a 2-page abstract. I don't know whether this actually will characterize. So let's read through them at any rate. This lecture will draw upon 3 areas in the title of the summer school: language, cognition, and neuroscience, with orientation to an East Asian perspective. I was hoping to be able to say something about lexicothones and sonograms, but depends on time. Since it's the first lecture in the summer school, Part 1 will provide some basic introduction to the central concepts in all 3 areas, including brief historical backgrounds for these concepts. Hopefully, this part will give all the students of the summer school some common ground for participating in later activities. The second part, 2-part, will discuss the development of cognition and language across the lifespan, beginning with fetal life. With the rapid growth of the brain after birth, supporting an ever-increasing variety of perceptual, cognitive, and motor activities. Also, language is acquired before the body undergoes major changes associated with puberty. Neuroanatomical decline starts after the reproductive years and accelerates typically after 60 years of age. As the body gradually atrophies, especially the brain, many cognitive and linguistic functions may become compromised by age-related pathologies. I will be concerned with both normal and abnormal developments in this 2-part overview, and wherever appropriate, I will connect my remarks to the forthcoming activities of the summer school. And this PDF will be made available immediately after the lecture. I'm not sure I'll stay very close to this abstract that I sent Quentin. We'll see how it goes. Let me begin by giving you a little quiz. Many of you will recognize him, right? That's Andy Murray, one of the great tennis stars. And then there's a chimpanzee, a gorilla. All 3 are primates. Question is, which 2 primates are the closest relatives? Okay. If you ask this of the man on the street, he'll laugh at you and say, oh, of course these 2 may look at them. But looks are deceiving. We'll see that actually these 2 primates are the closest relatives. What is the evidence for such an incredible claim? Well, to begin with, they're fossils. People have been digging up fossils for several centuries now. And if you look at the fossil of a man, a fossil of a chimpanzee, a fossil of a gorilla, and so on, the resemblances are obvious, and it's also obvious that these 2 share many more similarities. In fact, Charles Darwin speculated on this question. And his very good friend, Thomas Huxley, wrote a book called Man's Condition in Nature, in which, right in the front of the book, he gave a series of skeletal remains of these, showing very clearly the relation between the chimpanzee and us. So fossils are obviously important, but there's another discipline that contributes vital information to this question of phylogeny. I hope everybody knows the word phylogeny as opposed to ontogeny. Phylogeny has to do with the evolution of species. So we could talk about the phylogeny of primates. And the other word, ontogeny, as opposed to phylogeny, refers to the evolutionary trajectory of single individuals. So on the phylogeny of apes, of primates, the other new important source of information is in the genes. If we look at the genes of these three primates, we'll see that there are all sorts of similarities. Over 90% similarities in the DNA between humans and the chimpanzee. In a way, this is not surprising because life has been on this planet for billions of years. And for most of these billions of years, the chimpanzee and us share the same biological development. So it's not surprising. We share a tremendous amount of genes. Fossils, genes. But recently, within the last 20 years or so, another powerful body of evidence came to help us solve this question. Geneticists have become so clever that they're able to take fossils and extract genes from these fossils. So rather than modern DNA, we also have ancient DNA. I remember I was at Berkeley 20-some years ago, a colleague of mine, Alan Wilson. He was a very eminent biologist, and he gave a faculty lecture speculating that one day we'll be able to take genes from fossils. And he exemplified his speculation by taking an extinct animal, kind of a horse, and extracting fossils from it. A lot of progress has been made in ancient DNA, and it's primarily this man. He has a Finnish name, PolyU, but he's actually done most of his work in the Max Planck Institute in Germany. Max Planck Institute of Evolutionary Anthropology. And his book, his first name is Svante, holding up the head of the Neanderthal. There are no Neanderthals left. They died out 30,000, 40,000 years ago. And yet, Svante was able to extract DNA from Neanderthals and show that many, many millennia ago, our own ancestors mated, had sex with him, because we carry some of their genes. And so for the past, this book was published in 2014, but for the past decade, ancient DNA has been marching along very, very rapidly, making good progress. And this geneticist at Harvard University, David Reich, recently, this last year, put out a very good book summarizing the findings of ancient DNA and modern DNA in order to answer the question who we are and how we got here. One of the things that Svante did in Axie was to train a lot of young people, because scholarship depends on the transmission of knowledge from generation to generation. And having young scientists come up is a vital aspect for science to progress. One of the people that Svante trained is Fu Xiaomei, now in Beijing at the Academy of Sciences. And back in 2013, Xiaomei wrote a paper with Svante and a few other people on the fossils discovered around Beijing, this place called Jianyuan. This was published in the Proceedings of the National Academy of Sciences in America and discussed in several later papers, including in Current Biology and Trends in Genetics. These other places are also places where ancient DNA has been excavated, has been extracted. So in this paper, in this 2013 paper, Xiaomei makes this remark. As we extracted DNA from a 40,000-year-old anatomically modern human. Okay? This sometimes is abbreviated as AMH, anatomically modern human. This means their proportions are very much like us. And if Chen Man walked in through that door, we would not be really surprised. On the other hand, if Beijing walked in, he goes back almost a million years. We'd be scared. He looks so different. So the 40-year-old anatomical modern human from Xianyuan. And the DNA typically comes from two sources. One is called the mitochondrial DNA. This is found in the cells, but outside the nucleus. There are all sorts of little proteins called mitochondria, each with its very small complement of genes. The important thing to know about mitochondrial DNA is that it's transmitted maternally, mother to daughter, all the way down. So if you want to find out the history of women, you concentrate on mitochondrial DNA. The other source of DNA, the major source of DNA, is in the nucleus of the cell itself. And within the nucleus of the human cell, there are little strands which are intertwined, and we have 23 such pairs. Each such strand is called a chromosome. So chromosome 21 is the 21st pair of these 23 pairs. So Xiaomei extracted DNA from this man from Xianyuan, mostly from mitochondrial DNA and from chromosome 21, and is able to come to very interesting conclusions. Says the Jianyuan derived from a population that was ancestral to many present-day Asians. He was one of our ancestors, as well as to Native Americans. We know that Native Americans went to Native America from Asia. but this was after Tiananmen's time. Before Tiananmen's time, the Asians and the Europeans split. So that lineage goes further back than 40,000. This gives you a flavor of the type of knowledge that we have about our own distant past. I mentioned Neanderthal went extinct 30,000 years ago. Near where the Neanderthal was discovered in a cave on the border of Mongolia and Russia, there's a cave called the Denisovan Cave. They discovered some fossils there and found yet another species related to humans. So in addition to Neanderthal men, we also have Denisovan men. And this is a much later discovery than Neanderthal. A lot of work has been done. And now we know that Denisovans started up north, migrated southward, went through Tibet, and gave some of its genes to Tibetans. So they intermarried with Tibetans. And later on, wound up in Southeast Asia, New Guinea. That's where most of the Denisovan genes are found. And it's interesting that they left these genes in Tibet because these are the genes that allow Tibetans to make very, very intensive use of the oxygen that they breathe in, giving them the possibility of living at such high altitudes. Most of us will not last long at 6,000 meters, 8,000 meters. The Tibetans, with Denisovan genes, have this ability. So even 20, 30, 40,000 years ago, Denisovans, Neanderthals, Homo sapiens are thought have been mixing. So it's not surprising that now we are the products of millennia and millennia of genetic mixing. There is no such thing as a pure race. Genes are being exchanged all the time. When people migrate, they leave. They come into contact. When they come into contact, two things get exchanged: language and genes. So we talk about Chinese speaking Hanyu. What is Han? There is no pure Han. There is only a mixed bag where all sorts of tribal people over the thousands of years, people mixing, people integrating, people dividing, then merging again. A good way to see this is from this immunological study done by Zhao and Li. Zhao was working in Shanghai and Li was from the American Red Cross. They took blood from almost 10,000 Chinese at 74 different regions. Xinjiang, Hainan Dao, Zhejiang, Yunnan, Sichuan, all over. And these are the 74 regions at which they took blood samples in order to examine the genetic relationship. So if you put these 74 populations together and construct a family tree, here is the root, and after this root, the two major clusters. What are the clusters separated from? The two great river valleys. From 1 to 42, these are all populations living along Yellow River and regions nearby. 43 to 74, Hangjiang. Geography plays an extremely important role. If you stand this tree on its head, you'll find that 19 and 20, where are they? 19 and 20. One of them is Hui, the other one is Han. The Han in that area, the Han in area 20 is genetically closest to the Hui in area 20 than it is to the other Hans further away. So we have the saying in Chinese, 远亲不如近邻. This applies genetically. And in the map, there's the Huanghe, here is the Changjiang, and you can see the distribution of the 74 sites. And this separation here at the root corresponds to separation along latitude number 30, which runs from Lhasa to Shanghai, right along the Changjiang. Linguists have long noted that geography plays a very important role in culture, including, of course, language. One of the first linguists that talked about this was a man called Schmidt, Johannes Schmidt. And in 1872, he talked about the formation of the Indo-European speech. We say Indo-European, but early it was actually called Indo-Germanic. It's the same family. And Indo-European or Indo-Germanic includes these, among others, these families: Celtic, such as Irish, Scottish; Italic, such as Italian, Sardinian; Greek, Germanic, including English; also Slavic, Indo-Iranian, Persian, Armenian, and as kind of an illustration of this wave theory, Wellen theory is the German word for wave theory. We can see a diagram like this. We can see that certain features, Celtic shares with Italic, Italic shares with Greek, Italic with German, Indo-Iranian with Chinese, and these are all geographical aids. Geography plays a very important role for understanding genetic makeup and linguistic makeup. A French geneticist a few years ago, called Marie, he wrote about some probabilistic schemas on the variation of natural population. And shortly after that, a very eminent Japanese geneticist called Shimuro Moto turns this idea into a stepping stone model. Population increase or decrease depending on their geographical distance. So if you plot distance against against the genetic affinity to craft something. I had a very good geneticist friend when I was in Berkeley. He was at Stanford. His name was PolyU. PolyU told me about this, and he asked me, if you can do this for people, then we also do it with language. So let's try. So we took 17 islands in the South Pacific, and they're called Micronesian islands. We measured their distance on one hand, and the degree that they shared their vocabulary on the other. And we wrote this paper for language called Spatial Distance and Lexical Replacement, and the result was quite gratifying. So you have distance, proportion of shared vocabulary, and it's a relatively nice exponential curve. Okay, now let's return to the quiz of 3 primates. If we look at their genes and fossils and so on, we can construct a family tree. This tree is published in a few years ago by Daniel Lieberman, who is the chairman of anthropology at Harvard University. So according to Lieberman, the last common ancestor of chimps, gorillas, and us was around 9 million years ago. So about 9 million years ago, gorillas went its own way. 6 million years ago, we split from the chimpanzees. About less than 2 million years ago, the chimpanzees again split into 2 species. One is called the bonobos, the other is called pan, and they're very, very different chimpanzees, very, very different behaviors. One is very aggressive, with an alpha male frequently fighting. The other, the bonobo, is controlled by shared power among females, and they're much, much more loving. Before we discovered the bonobos, people said, we're just like chimpanzees. Can't say that anymore, because there are 2 types of chimpanzees. Some of us are like one type, some of us are like the other type. After the separation from the chimpanzee, a very important step we took was that we stood up. They stood up too, but not in the way that we do. We stood up very straight, they stood. They're kind of stretched like this. When we walk, our knees are usually long, like this. And when chimpanzees walk, it's called knuckle walk. You actually would have 3 legs with something like that. And the reaction. System. So this was an extremely important event in our journey toward becoming modern. What are the consequences of standing up? The whole body got restructured. But most importantly, we freed our hands. We don't use the hands to pound the ground anymore. We develop an opposable thumb for power grasping and dexterity with each hand. Those of you who've taken musical instruments realize how important dexterity things. So with these dexterous hands, we started making tools. Other animals make tools too. For instance, chimpanzees would take off a twig and poke it into a tree hole to eat termites. My ancestors started making tools in a much greater sophisticated variety. Stones for pounding, stones for cutting, stones for drilling, all sorts of stuff. And from stones, we make more stones and so on. So that tool making started about 2 billion years ago, became identified with our genus. We are called Homo sapiens. Our genus is Homo, and Homo is the animal that starts making tools like our ancestors. So this is roughly Homo in Chinese is the shu, or the genus, sapiens is the tribe, or the species. So this is a more careful discussion of the issues we've been discussing. We all belong to the order, biological order of primates, 灵长类. And about 35, 40 million years ago, certain monkeys split off. These are the monkeys that we find out in the Americas, especially South America. The monkeys we find in Asia and Africa are called old-world monkeys. They stayed with us a little bit longer. And the remaining clade are all apes, no tails. Gibbons have no tail, orangutans have no tail, and these are found in mostly Southeast Asia. The two African apes, the gorilla and the chimpanzee, are the closest to us. They are our closest living relatives. Neanderthals and Denisovans were closer, but they're extinct. And this line, this is a study by a geneticist, Eric Allender, and it shows that we and the chimpanzee differ only by 1.2%. This is what I said a little while back. We share such a long span of common evolutionary history, so our genes are largely similar. But the line in this slide that I want people to pay special attention to, very important for the topic of the summer school, is this one, bottom one. Brain volumes in cc's, in cubic centimeters. Whereas our brains go from about 1100 to 1700 cc's, the chimpanzee's brain is only about 1/3 or 1/4 as large. And even though the gorilla is huge compared to us, its brain is less than that. So what do we do with this huge brain, in addition to the dexterous hands? Well, it seems that our life has different stages. If we take a look at the monkey, it starts out as an infant, becomes a juvenile requiring very little care, then becomes an adult. That's when it starts fighting for territory, fighting for food, and so on, as an individual in the tribe. And a monkey lives maybe 25 years. If we look at chimpanzees, early hominids, their lifestyle is not all that different from that of the monkey. But with us, after the infancy, before the juvenile, we have a period called childhood. This is unique to our species. During childhood, we have complete care, all the food, all the protection from our kind. And during this period, the brain keeps on going very, very fast, learning the abundant amount of information that has built up in our culture. So this is a device that allows our species, humans, to evolve along two dimensions. First, biological dimension, just like the other half. And then, with the invention of tools, with the accumulation of culture, with a brain that's able to absorb all this, we start on another track called cultural evolution. In cultural evolution, our basis is much, much, much faster than biological evolution. So this is kind of a cartoon recap. 6 million years ago, we split from the chimps. 3.5 million years ago, we stood up. And at that time, we were still not Homo. We belonged to a different genus called Australopithecus, only found in Africa. Then when we started making tools, we became Homo. And about 150, 200,000 years ago, we developed our own species. We became anatomically modern humans. And of course, with the invention of electronics, computer, and so on, less than 100 years ago, cultural evolution really goes at a very, very, very fast pace. So a major player in all this scenario is the brain. As we saw, our brain is many times larger than that of our close relatives. And as early as 2,500 years ago, the ancient Greek scientist Hippocrates already knew that the brain is the central player in our lives. All men are to know that from nothing else than from the brain comes joys, delights, laughter, scorn, sorrow, grief, and so on. In these ways, I am of the opinion that the brain exercises the greatest power in the man. This is the interpreter to us of those things which emanate from the air when it happens to be in sound state. So you think you see with your eyes, but you don't see just with your eyes. Your eyes feed information to the brain, and you see what the brain tells you you saw. Reality is actually much more indirect than most of us realize. And when the brain tells you wrong things, it becomes disorder, like schizophrenia, split brain, things like that. So when it's not in a sound state, all sorts of neurodegenerative studies, neurodegenerative situations happen, make us sick. This quote, by the way, is taken from a book by two linguists, Kami Shivan and Machivatani. The book is called Syntactic Complexity, a very good book. But even though Hippocrates knew so early that the brain is important. It took thousands of years before anybody was able to do anything for understanding the brain a little bit more. And by far the most important scientist is this man. His name was Vesalius. Back in 1543, in the middle of the 16th century, Vesalius was the first to open up the head, take out brains, dissect them, and make very, very detailed drawings. These drawings are still used in textbooks in medical school today, 500 years later. Shows the quality of his work. So beneath the bone, there are various meninges, various membranes. Vesalius peeled back these meninges to expose the actual neurons. Okay. So here is the right hemisphere, here is the left hemisphere. The brain is shaped like a walnut, two hemispheres. This portion that we see on the surface is called the cortex. It's the word meaning bark on the tree. It's the covering. But because the brain grew so large compared to chimpanzees, gorillas, and so on, so large, so fast, and the head is so small, it got crinkled. And as it crinkled, some parts fold out, some parts fold in. The parts that fold out, each one is called a gyrus, plural is gyri, and the parts that fold in, each one is called a sulcus, and the plural is sulci. So we see the right hemisphere, lots of gyri, lots of sulci, and lots of blood vessels. The brain is a very, very expensive organ. Of all the blood that the heart pumps out, 1/5 of it goes through the brain. And if anything goes wrong with any of these vessels, large vessels, small vessels, the neurons lose their nourishment, and you have a stroke. Zhongfeng, what is Zhongfeng? Zhongfeng is the brain being damaged by the lack of blood supply. So in this picture, the right brain and the left brain are separated. And this is just for viewing. In the real world, of course, they're pressed against each other. If you look at a picture like this, you think that maybe the cortex is one sheet where everything is connected to each other. It's like a fish net. This turned out to be a wrong impression. Actually, if you take a microscope, a powerful microscope with a good lens, and look at the brain, it's not all connected. It's millions and millions of little units. Each one is called a neuron. Neurons and neurons are not connected. They're separated by a little cleft, and this cleft is called the synapse. Very, very tiny, 20 to 40 nanometers wide. And it was to the everlasting credit of this Spanish doctor by the name of Ramon Santiago y Cajal, who made this discovery. There he is, sitting in his kitchen with his microscope. This should be very revealing to us. You don't need huge buildings, large teams, shiny equipment, and so on, to make intellectual breakthroughs. What you should do is think deeply and think bravely. And that's what this Spanish doctor did. He looked into his microscope again and again, making very, very detailed sketches of what he sees. This is a very important part of the brain called the hippocampus, and drawn by Cahal. So, of course, such great contribution deserved great reward. In 1906, Cahal was awarded the Nobel Prize. And since Cahal, there's been about a dozen or so Nobel Prizes, explicating further how neurons communicate with each other. Basically, a neuron has a cell body, and various processes that stick out. Of the processes that stick out, most are for receiving information, and one for sending out information. The one that's sending out information is called the axon, A-X-O-N. Sometimes it can get very long, such as the nerve sending information down my leg. The axon travels halfway down. Some are very, very short. Now the axon is coated with a type of material called myelin. Comes in sheath form, myelin sheath wrapping around the axon. So how does neuron A talk to neuron B? Neuron A sends out a small electrical signal called the action potential, and it travels down this axon. But because there's myelin wrapped around the axon, it's able to jump across the myelin. This type of conduction is called saltatory. It's from the French word sauter, to jump. Saltatory conduction of the action potential is much, much faster. And once it's at the end, near the synapse, it shares the synapse with dendrites of the next neuron. So the A neuron deposits various chemicals into the synapse. These chemicals are called neurotransmitters, such as acetylcholine, dopamine, serotonin, dozens of different types. And these neurotransmitters are picked up by the dendrites of the recipient. So this is the basic way your brain talks to itself. And myelin is extremely important because myelin, on the one hand, helps in the conduction speed. On the other hand, it guards against crosstalk from other neurons. But how many neurons are there? How do you count such a huge number? If I start counting 1, 2, 3, it'll take me centuries. So somehow you have to use some methods to estimate. Previously, people have estimated, and the number that's used quite a lot in the literature is 10 to the 11th, or 100 billion. 100 followed by 9 zeros. This is only a very rough guess, and people didn't know which part of the brain has how many and so on. Until recently, 2009, a team of researchers in Brazilian researchers, actually developed methods of counting the number of neurons, counting the number of cells quite effectively. So here's the brain on which they base their numbers. And this whole brain is on the large side, and the whole brain weighs over 1,500 grams. And since each gram takes up approximately 1 cc, so 1,500 grams is a 1,500 cc brain. And it has 86 billion neurons, and also around 85 billion non-neurons. This is an important lesson from the account. When we talk about the brain, we are typically talking about neurons, but there are actually just as many non-neurons in the head as there are neurons. What are all these non-neurons doing there? This is something neuroscience has very little idea about. Some neuroscientists are beginning to focus on this. There's a book called The Other Half of the Brain by a neuroscientist in Washington. He's talking about the non-neurons. Another interesting thing is the cerebral cortex, which is the pride and joy of our species, because no other species has such a complicated cerebral cortex. But the cerebral cortex only has about 16 billion neurons. That's a very, very small percentage of the 86. Where are most of the neurons? In the cerebellum. The cerebellum has close to 70 billion neurons. I thought the majority of neurons are actually in the cerebellum. So only half of the cells in the brain are neurons, and the cerebellum, not the cortex, has most of these. So a lot of work, very intensive work is going on in all of the developing countries, US, China, UK, and so on. I'm just trying to understand these neurons by first giving them a typology, classifying them, first by shape, then by function, and also starting to these non-neurons. We're really very much at the beginning of understanding the brain. And so there's a whole world to conquer for you young people. Hopefully by the time you get around my age, we'll know a lot more about the brain. And knowing more about the brain means knowing more about ourselves. Knowing more about ourselves means that maybe we can be better guests to our host Earth. Right now we're making a mess. One of the cartoons I showed you earlier shows the progress from the chimpanzee to the man sitting down at his computer. There's another version that I hesitate to show because it's a little bit rude. It has this whole sequence of development, and then at the end, instead of a man typing on his PC, there's a man saying, "Stop! We fucked up." Warning us we're not on the right path. And I think to know what the right path is, we have to know a lot more about ourselves, and to understand ourselves means to understand the brain. Well, a couple of years back, I went to did a series of lectures in Taiwan, and they made this picture. It's useful because they colored the various lobes differently, making it easier to remember. So this is looking at the brain from the left side or right side. Left side. Okay? This is from the left side. This big lobe here is called the frontal lobe. In many of these slides, I put both languages in because hopefully many of us will continue to work in an Asian country, and we have to know the technical terminology used in China as well as used internationally. So this is the frontal lobe. Remind me when it's on fall for something. Okay. Behind the frontal lobe is the parietal lobe. Behind the parietal lobe is the occipital lobe. And in purple here is the temporal lobe. And the cerebellum that we were talking about is this green part here, called 小脑. Rather than going with a very, very detailed diagram of the brain, I think we'll just use a simple diagram to mention some of the important sites of the brain. There's a sulcus. Everybody remembers sulcus now. That's where the cortex goes in. Very important sulcus. This is called the central sulcus, 中央周. This is a very important landmark because in front of the central sulcus is the motor area, controlling movement throughout the body. And if we had a diagram of the body along the motor area, we'll see that the body is upside down. The tongue, the lips, the head, the neck, and so on are down here. The legs, the feet, and so on are over there. So it's upside down. So given that the lips, the tongue, the mouth, and so on are over here, what do you think is this relation to speech? When you lose the ability to speak, first discovered by somebody called Broca, is this area that he noticed that was damaged. This is why it's called Broca's area. Behind the central sulcus is the counterpart. Instead of motor, it's sensory. So we have the central sulcus. Again, the body is represented upside down. The other major sulcus, in addition to the central sulcus, is the lateral sulcus. And below the lateral sulcus is the temple. The temporal lobe has two very important areas for linguists: an auditory area somewhere around here, and behind it, an Wernicke's area, which is very important for semantics. The occipital lobe is for visual. I'm sure you'll come across these diagrams again and again these 4 weeks. And this kind of a preliminary exposure perhaps will help some of you. So a very important summary of some of the things that I just said can be seen from this diagram published by Norman Geschwin, who was a professor of neurology at Harvard University for many decades. His article is called Specialization of the Human Brain, and it's collected in a book that's been translated into Chinese called 语言有限发展语言化. So, Geschwin says, what does the brain do when we have to speak a hard word? So somebody says something, it bangs on your eardrums, that signal goes to your primary auditory area, which is right around here. Right around here. Right around here. You have to understand what's said to you. So the part of the brain that handles a lot of semantics kicks in. And that's called Wernicke's area. So somebody says, flashlight. And the Wernicke says, he said flashlight. Now I have to repeat it. How do I repeat it? I have to get in touch with that portion of my brain, which is in charge of motor movements of speech. To do that, there's a bundle of fibers connecting the two areas. It's called the arcuate fasciculus. It's arched. It's arched. And fasciculus just means it's a bundle. And this bundle of information goes to Broca's area, which activates the motor strip in front of the central sulcus in order to speak. Flashlight. So this is a very rough idea of how speech is possible. So we've seen the work of these three pioneers who studied language. Broca, who in 1861 published the first paper relating language to the brain. Broca was a polymath. He was an expert in many fields. And one day, a friend of his said, please see a patient for me. We don't know how to help him. And this man came in, and turned out he could only say one syllable. The syllable spelled in French is C-A-N, something like thumb. So the literature called him Monsieur Thumb, Mr. Thumb. So Broca helped him for a long time, trying to provide some kind of remedy that was not too helpful. It was a brain damage that people didn't know how to deal with. A few months later, another friend recommended a patient, and this man spoke 5 words. So it's 5 times better than Monsieur Tan. And he knew how to say, thank you, goodbye, and so on, and his own name. After these 2 people died, Broca did autopsy on their brains. And he was very excited to see that the site of injury is the same for these 2 patients. It's in the lower side of the frontal lobe in the hemisphere. And this 1861 paper describes this, and people since that time call that area Broca's area, and the type of aphasia, the type of language disorder that people have, Broca's effect. Very shortly after Broca made this important discovery, Wernicke did a very similar thing, but with the semantics, with this area here. Wernicke's aphasic understand often what you say and can speak very, very fluently. But what he says most of the time doesn't make sense. Many of the things that he says are not words. So a physiologist sometimes calls this type of output jargon aphasia. It's like he's speaking his own language. But it has all of the rhythm, all the fluency of the native language. And the third pioneer, Deschamps, had a different type of experience. This patient came in. He was a very successful businessman in his 50s and 60s. And nothing seemed to be wrong. Except when he woke up morning a few days ago, he could no longer read. Nothing wrong with his eyesight. If you give him an eye chart, he can tell you everything. But if you give him a letter, say S, he cannot say S. He'll say, gee, that looks like a circle. If you give a letter capital A, he said, it looks like a painter. It looks like a painter's easel. Nothing wrong with his eyesight. But somehow, connection of visual experiences to the language code has been discovered. And this has been called dyslexia. Serious cases are called alexia. Mild cases you come across quite often. For instance, when I was teaching large courses at Berkeley, quite often, several hundred students, some students will come up and say, I'm mildly dyslexic. I cannot distinguish saw, S-A-W, and was, W-A-S, things like that. So such students very frequently request the help of somebody sitting beside them when they take exams, which is fine. But Deschamps' case was extreme, no longer good. After this became known, various other forms of lack of reading ability surfaced. For instance, the inability to read musical scores. So Broca identified the spot which was damaged in his two patients, and he identified this area as Broca's area. And he was a very foresightful man who was very wise. He said, we don't really know very much about the brain. I see this damage here, but I hate to cut into it. Because if I cut into it, the brain will be damaged, and later generations of scientists who will know a lot more than I do will be deprived of the chance of studying this phenomenon. So he took the brains and stored them in jars of formaldehyde in Paris. 100 or so years later, a young friend of mine in the Broncos, in fact, he took my course, Biology of Language at Berkeley. She learned about these brains, and she said, now we have such more powerful techniques for imaging the brain. Why don't I see if I can get access to those brains and run detailed imaging analysis? So Nina got in touch with the descendants of Paul Broca, got the jars out, in the Paris Museum. And these are the two brains. These are both brains of Mr. Lebon, or Monsieur Dan. Here is the left hemisphere. Here is the cerebellum. Here is the frontal lobe. And here's the lesion. And here the close-up of the lesion. I should say that at the time that the Broca was operating, Wernicke was operating, there was a fad in medical circles and also in society in general called phrenology, Phrenology, phrenology. These people, some of them were doctors, believe that even very abstract traits like courage, loyalty, deceitfulness are stored in well-circumscribed areas of the brain. And since the brain is randomly skull, somebody who's very experienced can feel the skull. Say, you're a very great man, or other things. This was called phrenology. There's an ounce of truth in this, in that all of these properties are definitely featured in the brain. But of course, they're not that localized. So Broca, Wernicke, Desjardins, these people were highly localized. Neither drunkers had an idea. But given the language is such an extremely complex behavior, it must involve many regions of the brain, not just this one little region. So Nina went and did extensive MR, magnetic resonance imaging of both of these brains. Lots of sections, sagittal sections, coronal sections, axial sections, and so on. And reported this in detail in the journal Brain in 2007. I'll just read a small portion of it. Sagittal, axial, and coronal slices. Okay. So maybe not everybody is familiar with these words. Sagittal means cutting the head this way. So when you look at a phonetic stone showing the tongue making articulations, that's a mid-sagittal section. So these are sagittal sections. Axial sections are sliced like this. Coronal section. So with these three types of sections, fed to the computer can reconstitute it to give you a 3D imaging of the brain. So these slices reveal lesions in the left inferior frontal gyrus, that's what Broca said, deep inferior parietal lobe, and anterior superior temporal lobe. All of the lobes were damaged. In addition, there is extensive subcortical involvement. We didn't talk about all of the very important clusters of neurons subcortically, including the rostrum, putamen, globus pallidus, head of the caudate nucleus, and so on and so on. I think the lesson here is very simple. We must not overly localize. Certainly given the function, some portion of the brain is probably more importantly involved, other portion of the brain perhaps less so, but the whole brain is working like a total information processing unit. Of course, the brain grew to this complexity through a lot of cell divisions. How did it start out? It started out very, very small. So when the mother's cell and the father's cell united to form you, it was extremely tiny, that one cell, having the DNA from father and from mother. 30 days, it's beginning to assume shape. 40 days. At 40 days, you can see certain provenances in the brain. So if we take this and straighten it out, take this and straighten it out, we'll see that it's actually a tube. And these three provenances correspond to what's called the forebrain, midbrain, and hindbrain. Each of these will elaborate into more and more complex neural structures. By the time the brain is 6 months old, it takes essentially the overall shape of the adult brain. But notice, it's actually still quite smooth. Smooth means that the cortex is not expanded to form the gyri and the sulci. So in English, sometimes you insult somebody by saying you're a smooth brain creature. This means that the brain is not yet fully developed. And gradually, in the remaining 3 months, develop all this crinkled appearance. But even by 6 months, the auditory system is largely in place. This means that the fetus in mommy's tummy can actually hear language. Not language in the way that we hear it airborne, but hear it in a very muffled way, low-passed. Only the low frequencies are heard. Nonetheless, it can hear a lot of mommy talk as well as sounds from outside. With ultrasound, we're able to look at some of the things that the baby's doing. So this baby is around 6 months inside the baby, inside the womb, and I don't know how well you can see, but this picture actually shows, according to the authors, the baby grimacing. That's what we do. The top right shows a baby sucking his finger. Babies come out sucking different fingers. My oldest child came out sucking his thumb. My second son sucked his two fingers. And babies are all different, but they practice early. This one, thrusting the tongue out. Can everybody see the tongue? And this one, this is thrust to the side, this is thrust to the back. This exercise, of course, is vitally important. When the baby's inside, it gets nourishment through the umbilical cord in the mother's blood. But the moment it's born, the umbilical cord is cut, where is it going to get its food? From the nipple. But what if it doesn't know how to suck? What if the muscles are holding the nipple, the labial muscle, the retraction of the tongue to create a vacuum to suck? What if these functions are not in place? The baby will die in a few hours. So this is extremely important. And it's also interesting that these movements are also centrally involved in speech. So here's a baby that's just born. And he's a psychologist called Andrew Meltzoff at the University of Washington. Back in the 1970s, he went from hospital to hospital, making faces at babies. So here's Meltzoff sticking his thumb out, baby says. Here's Meltzoff opening his mouth. Here's Meltzoff pursing his lips. No problem. Neonates, they are too old, imitating. That's another very important factor for language acquisition. You imitate. So the urge to learn, powered by the ability to imitate, is very, very important to our species. But recently, we found that it's important to other primates. Here you have a monkey facing somebody sitting on the sun, he sits on the sun. Another interesting aspect of neonates is they always utter a cry. And a few years back, in 2009, some German investigators decided that babies with different native language backgrounds seem to cry differently. So here's the French cry, French baby. Here's, if this is an idealized pitch pattern, baby cries like, ah, as opposed to a German baby who cries like, ah. Not every time, not every baby, but statistically significant. So this is an effect of the feet is being able to hearing the movement. Once of hearing this type of possibility, this possibility. In Mambe's team, there was another woman called Kathleen Blanca. She went on to extend these studies. So for instance, she studied Mandarin speakers and German speakers, as well as an African language called Uso in West Africa. And her findings seem to suggest that Mandarin has a little bit more complex cry, because Mandarin is a tone language, and tones complexify the pitch contour. And Uso is still more complex, because according to the literature, Uso has 9 tones. So this is all very, very intriguing, especially for us who are not speakers of tone languages and investigators of tone languages. So Professor Zhang Caizai has been in touch with Kathleen Blanca to see whether we can add to this data Cantonese data, because Cantonese also has 9 tones. And it should be something comparable to Inso, which has 9 tones. In any case, there's a lot of work done now since the 1940s on how languages are acquired from infancy. The early studies were done by a German with a bilingual child called Leopold. An important study was done by a Russian linguist, very eminent linguist called Roman Jakobson, in which he tried to compare child language with aphasia, with historical linguistics. But over the several decades now, stimulated in part by an important book by Roger Brown at Harvard University called A First Language. A lot of experiments, a lot of observations, a lot of databases. And much of this is summarized in this very convenient table that Patricia Kuhl prepared. Patricia Kuhl is also a psychologist at the University of Washington. In fact, she's the wife of Andrew Belsaw, the guy who made Funny Faces. Very nice scene. And the article is called Phonetic Learning as a Pathway to Language. In this table, you'll see that month by month, from birth to a year old, the various functions are specified for perception and for production. Perception, of course, precedes production because production must wait for adequate muscle control. So it tells you at what time the infants can discriminate. And it contrasts in all languages. And at what time disability seems to be reduced, since needs to discriminate all contrasts. A good example is the two liquid consonants in English, R and L. Right? We have L like light and R as in light. But this distinction is not made in Japanese, not made in lots of languages. Japanese being one of them. For instance, in a Toyota that I bought a long time ago, the glove compartment where you put bags and so on was marked Grove compartment, Grove, instead of GLOVE, because they don't distinguish Illinois. But Japanese infants have no such problem. They hear L distinctions as clearly as any other infant. But over many months of not making use of that distinction, that ability to discriminate L and R gradually happens. It's not prepared to attend to that distinction involved. So, decline in foreign language consonant perception at around 11 years. Another thing that Kuhl includes in this table is kind of interesting. It's called statistical learning. As I speak to you here, you don't get this sensation that it's a stream of unbroken sound. But it is. You speak to an oscilloscope, you speak to a sonogram, and you see it's a continuous stream. So when an infant hears speech, it hears a stream. Somehow it has to segment it, it has to cut into it. Because only if you cut into it and pull a chunk out, then you have the possibility of learning, oh, that chunk of sound means light. So segmenting is extremely important. How do you segment? Well, it turned out that One technique is by statistical learning. Danny Safran is a psychologist at the University of Wisconsin. She did this experiment with 8-month-old infants 20 years ago. The infants would hear Lori, Lobi, Rongola, Rubi, Daku, Madoki, and so on. A continuous stream for 3 or 4 minutes. After a few sessions of this, we found that the infants respond differently to different triplets of these syllables. Pu, pi, ro very often occur. Go, la, pu very often occur here. Pi, ro, go is not a favorite triplet. Go, pu, pi, da is not. The infant has extracted out certain 3 syllables which go together. So these are very probably meaningful. These are candidate words. So in addition to imitation, there are all these other capabilities that infants have. So you'd be born 3 months old, 1 year old, 2 years old, and so on. This is the chronology, and this is the weight of the brain. This is a famous diagram from a classic book called Biological Foundations of Language, written by Eric Lenneberg. So the brain starts out 300-400 grams, and over the first 2 years, boom, it explosively grew to over 1,000 grams, more than triple its weight in the first 2 years. This is part of the childhood that we talked about in an earlier slide. When an infant, when a child learns a tremendous amount of the local culture. By age 2, various things have taken shape, and Eric Lenneberg feels that around here to around puberty, this is the age most important for learning language. So sometimes in the literature, you find people talking about critical age. This is the so-called critical age for learning language. And they label this language acquisition. I think over the years since he showed this diagram, and the variants of this diagram in several places in this big book, people oversimplify the critical period. Earlier I mentioned Roman Jacobson. He was a very, very eminent linguist. When I was a graduate student, I heard him come and give a lecture, and the host introduced him as, ladies and gentlemen, I am honored to present to you Roman Jacobson. the only linguist in the world who speaks 12 languages fluently, all in Russian. And when he starts talking, sounds like Russian. But Jacobson wrote in many languages. He wrote in German, he wrote in French, he wrote in Norwegian because he spent some time in Norway, and he wrote a lot in English. There's no foreign accent. Language is much more than the motor skills of producing a set of sounds. These motor skills certainly have a maturational schedule. It's the same type of maturational schedule as when you play the piano or when you swing a tennis racket. All of these things, when taught young, are much better perfected. Same with the mouth muscles, tongue muscles, soft palate muscles, or talking. But language is a lot more than that. And language has words, lots and lots of words, grammar, and as a person becomes more and more mature, his language only improves because he's learned more words and is more familiar with the nuances with which they're used. But everything good comes to an end, and beyond a certain age, the brain doesn't handle language as well anymore. Let's see whether this will work. Yeah, I wonder if there's something. Yeah, there you go. Okay. Oh, good. You probably don't recognize me. A couple of years ago, I went and Dr. Manson Farm took an MRI of me, and this is what it looks like. So there would be 192 images scanned sagittably from one ear to the other. Let's see whether I can make it work. So it looks like I can stop it any place. So here I show two MRIs. One that Manson took of me, and one of Manson himself. As you saw, there are 192 frames. In this case, we stopped it at frame 87, frame 91, comparable frames in sagittal. A lot of detailed studies, of course, can be done. But even from these two diagrams, some things are quite clear. This is Manson's ventricle Ventricle is a sac in the middle of the brain, which holds cerebral spinal fluid. This is Manson's. This is mine. Manson's is about 5,000 cubic millimeters. Mine is almost 7 times as large. What does this indicate? My brain is shrinking. These are people whose brains have shrunk also. The longest human lifespan is Jean Calment. He lived 122 years. This is somebody that Chinese linguists would know, Zhou Yuguang. He's the one that advocated the pinyin that we all use. He lived 111 years. And this is something that he wrote when he was 111 years old. So these people, as far as we can see, were still quite functional late in their lives. But not everybody is fortunately spared. This is a portrait of Alois Alzheimer. And in 1911, Alzheimer wrote on certain peculiar diseases of old age. This was the patient that Auguste Deter, that he was caring for. And again, using this microscope, he noticed there are 2 very distinctive abnormalities in his brain cells. One called tau tangles, and one called beta amyloid plaques. Plaques are outside of brain cells, tangles are within brain cells. This gives you a picture of contrasting a healthy brain with an Alzheimer's brain. This is like the small ventricles that Manson had, and this is like the large ventricle. And now we know how the brain atrophies relative to its various regions. There's a region called entorhinal cortex that atrophies the most. The hippocampus also, and then the frontal lobe. The other lobes are relatively spared. But the ventricles, of course, expand much beyond its normal size. I was doing mostly historical linguistics for most of my scholarly career. And this made a huge impact on me. Alcorn was born in Shanghai in 1933. And I was born in Shanghai in 1933. And through our professional lives, we very often got together, chatted in Shanghai sometimes, and he was, for a while, Chancellor of the Chinese University of Hong Kong. And here's a picture that we took in Hong Kong at the Chinese University. He was, of course, a great scientist, father of fiber optics. But by the time he was awarded in 2009 the Nobel Prize, he could not accept it. His wife, Gwen, had to go speak on his behalf. Many times I went to visit him. He lost control of any of the 3 languages that he was fluent in. So he had Alzheimer's disease. And his doctor said that the tau, the beta amyloid, these things had been hurting his brain decades before he was clinically analyzed. So it's really important for us to understand what is happening to the brain as much as possible to prevent such decades of damage being done to the brain. So this paper by Jack in 2010 in Lancet is a very often quoted diagram of when you begin to have too much beta amyloid, too much tau, reduced brain structure, that by the time you report to the clinic to complain about the loss of brain functions, it's already much too late. Luckily, experiments are being done to show what's happening with language in the elderly brain. For instance, in the young brain, there's a lot of hemispheric asymmetry. Each hemisphere in taking more of charge of some tasks than the others. In the old brain, hemispheric asymmetry is reduced. And here's some experiments showing the reduction in hemispheric asymmetry. And Cabeza, who first noticed it, calls this the Harold model, hemispheric asymmetry reduction. Another difference between how elderly people process language and young people has been called the Asa model. This was noticed a decade ago, called the posterior to anterior shift in aging. Asa just stands for posterior to anterior shift in aging. Many of the tasks that the back of the brain performs in young people is shifted from. So there are all sorts of ways that as the brain atrophies, other portions of the brain take over to compensate for the loss. So it's crucial for us to know how much of our current knowledge, based on weird studies such as these, actually apply to Chinese studies. For instance, there is something called melodic intonation therapy that was first initiated in Boston. When a person loses his ability to speak, he becomes aphasic, and these people found that if you teach these physics to sing first, then gradually take away the melody, non-melodious speech sometimes remains. This is a way of helping them regain speech. Instead of saying, "Good morning, how are you today?" Say, "Good morning, how are you?" Like that, okay? And the melody, it makes the words more salient. After the aphasic recovers to some extent, removing the melody, retains some of the benefits. Now, we saw earlier that infants' cry may reflect tongue languages. We speak tongue languages. Each plays a more important role with us. Will it be true that melodic intonation therapy will work much better for speakers of tongue languages? We don't know. But it's a question that we cannot find answered in a weird literature. Questionnaires. Very often you go to a clinical exam. The doctor says, "I'll give you 3 minutes, name me as many words as you can that begin with the letter S." This doesn't make sense in the context of Chinese writing. You go to Sichuan and say, "Give me some words that begin with the letter S." Doesn't make sense. All sorts of cultural and linguistic matters need to be studied from our own perspective. There's a kind of a Bible-like thing called Diagnostic and Statistical Manual. Did I say it right? DSM. It's used universally. It was developed in America. And it's now beginning used in China. And some member of my team went and looked at the Chinese translation. It's terrible. It looks like a Google translation. Nobody who reads Chinese will understand their Chinese translation of that DSM. And yet it's not to be used. This is my last slide. Aging is not an isolated phenomenon. It's happening all over the world. And it's especially severe in China because of the many years of one-child policy. And now, as this diagram shows, the source is United Nations. Okay? People 60 or over almost tripled by the time we reach the middle of the century. This poses a tremendous financial burden on governments and a terrible psychological burden on families, unless we can help all these people age well. To provide that help, to meet this challenge, we need to know how the brain works, so that as people age, they can continue to function, be independent, and contribute to society. And we, who are the researchers after this type of knowledge, will be contributing not only to science, the science, life science of brain, but also importantly to our own society. So I hope many of you will consider this seriously. Thank you.
We have a few minutes for a couple of questions. Any questions from the students? Anyone? Any sort of questions will do. Asking for clarification, out of your own curiosity, or more in-depth questions, all of them are welcome. Yeah, Professor Jagan.
Always have a question. So that one study with infants where evidently the results showed that they were especially sensitive to trisyllabic chunking. So could you provide more details about the language? And that was just curious why food? But you gave no details about the native language that they were exposed to.
Well, the person who initiated this kind of research was Jenny Safran, lady psychologist at the University of Wisconsin. And the language, of course, as in Wisconsin with English. But it's been replicated in many other laboratories, including the University of Rochester. I think the particular language is not all that important. What is important is that the child, 8 months old, can somehow keep track of these syllables as they go by. This was just listening to a tape recording for 3 or 4 months, for 3 or 4 minutes, and after a few sessions, they respond differently to the ones which are syllables, in that sense, which co-occur frequently together, and not to those which do not co-occur together frequently.
So the stimuli, I mean, so you have monosyllabic, were they equal in intent? Were they equal, like intensity?
Approximately equal, yeah, on the tone. No pitch pattern to help. The segmenting was purely on statistical basis. This is only one of the studies. Patricia Kuhl says this type of statistical learning starts around 7 months, and there being other types that I haven't reviewed today.
So the other question I had was the expansion of the ventricles with aging. Could that be the cause of the hemisphere tendency then for hemisphere symmetry as opposed to asymmetry? But one would think that it's just expanding symmetrically, then maybe it's the left versus the right. That could still hold.
The expansion of the ventricles is a passive phenomenon. You didn't say, I want more space, give me more space. Rather, it's the loss of white matter and gray matter that initially kept it in. It's the atrophy of those gray and white matter that means more room for the ventricles to expand. But you raise an interesting question. I wonder whether different shapes in the expansion could result in different type compensatory shifting of brain activities. I don't know whether that helps. Come on, don't be afraid.
Don't be shy. Andrew has a question.
Since Stu is quite shy, let me start with another question. Thank you very much, Professor Wayne, for the very informative lecture. As we said, you're like a living encyclopedia to us. So it is important to emphasize that the scientific literature so far has been heavily skewed towards the Anglo-European context, as you said. And it's also important to enrich the literature by studying Chinese languages. So one question I've been thinking about is, if we were, as a researcher, be able to speak these Chinese languages, if we were to communicate to this international research community, why is it interesting to study Chinese languages in the context of neurological studies? What are the properties that could be particularly interesting? What are the properties of Chinese languages that could be particularly interesting? From a cognitive neuropsychological perspective, what would be the possible answers that, apart from tones, that you mentioned, that Chinese being a tone language? So what are the other typological properties of Chinese languages that could also be interesting in this context?
The Chinese language has been reviled repeatedly in Western literature. Beginning with 18th century literature on what the Chinese language is like. It's simple. It's so simple. And instead of speaking it, they sing it. And there are no ways of indicating past, present, on and on, this type of ethnocentric criticism, which do not hold water. So I think your question is right on point. Let's stress what are some of the positive aspects. Positive aspect is that why do you need all this tense and aspect and number and so on? You get along perfectly fine without them. Right? Even the adjective we use sometimes are biased. We say Chinese has an impoverished morphology. Why is it impoverished? It's simple. You don't have stuff that you don't need. I think in addition to some of the more conspicuous differences, the tone, the writing, is simple morphology. Chinese is very well worth studying because of the richness of its culture. Sometimes we're brainwashed into thinking that when we say something, we go into our mental lexicon, pull out the words, put them into the right syntax, and lo and behold, a nice sentence comes out. I don't think it's like that at all. I think very often there are all sorts of bits and pieces, constructions in our heads. And depending on the context, I go in there and pull out a few of those constructions and use them. This is very different from the generative view. One person that championed this view was a professor of linguistics at Harvard called Dwight Bollinger. He says, it's not relational. Very often it's memorable. So when I see Professor Li Ping sitting there and he's going to talk this afternoon, I should say something polite to him. I say, 下午我会洗耳恭听. Wash my ears. This reflects an attitude. And there are literally thousands and thousands of these things. How can we use I come here poorly prepared. But I'll tell you what I know in the hope of exchanging for your wisdom. How trying you I throw out bricks, I hope to get the jade back. So learning a language is much, much more than vowels and consonants and a few declensions and conjugations. Learning a language is getting the key to a treasure house of cultural attainments. And Chinese is one of the few languages that has a very, very rich treasure house. So, for instance, Xie, Gongtie, Patring, and Yu, these are all 四字词. These 四字词 have been accumulated for thousands of years. Some of them are very usable. And if you learn the right ones, they guide you toward better conduct, better behavior. Yeah, I knew I'd take you this far.
Thank you, Professor Wang, for this really wonderful lecture. You took us through human evolution, to language, to child language, to aging, from language to memory, to neuroscience. In fact, as you were talking, I realized some of my slides this afternoon could be better modified, so I was doing part of that. But at one point, you mentioned that the LCN can quickly or soon be expanded to LCNG. And you discussed one of the fascinating studies by this professor in Chinese Academy, Professor Fu, yeah. In their analysis of the cave people in Tianyuan, did they do any study or analysis that indicated the language capacity of those people in terms of? I had the fortune of visiting Professor Simon Fisher's lab just a couple of weeks ago, and I was totally taken by the ability in which they are able to do genetic analysis of language disorders. So, as you know, Simon Fisher was the person who discovered FOXP2 as it relates to human language disorders. So I'm just curious as one angle in which LCN could be expanded to LCNG, whether people such as Professor Fu, who came totally from a different angle to study human evolution, whether there may be bridges that could be built to help us understand language evolution and language disorder and therefore human language behavior. Thank you. Any comments and suggestions?
That's a very important topic. We talked about the Neanderthals. The Neanderthals actually had bigger brains than we do. Yet they went extinct. Quite often people from newspapers will call me and say, Professor Wang, did the Neanderthals have language? It's impossible to answer for now, of course, because looking at the skull, there's nothing left there that will tell you that they had language or did not have language. For a while, physical anthropologists will look at the depression inside the cranium and say, in our case, because of the left hemisphere, especially the lateral sulcus, is higher, because of the bulkier temporal lobe, it probably means it had language. But this is really highly speculative. On the other hand, as Professor Lee was hinting at, if one day we get so good in extracting ancient DNA, we have the full Neanderthal DNA. Once we have the blueprint on how this man was made with the genetic information, we could in turn infer what kind of brain it actually had. How big was its temporal lobe? Did it have anything like Parenchyma and things like that? Then, in that case, gradually, way in the distant future, we may be able to answer questions of the linguistic ability of other species. But at the same time, we must be cautious not to oversimplify. Simon Fisher was one of the people who contributed a lot to a gene called FOXP2, which was discovered in a family in London. This London family had a very well-defined lineage with 3 or 4 generations, all marked down. Some had this disorder, some did not have disorder, and it was found the ones who had disordered KE, FOXP2, the family was called KE by the way. The disordered ones had this language impairment. And the media got very excited by this and said, now we found the language gene. FOXP2 is the language gene. This is utter nonsense. We must be cautious in the same way as we were with Broca's. One little lesion here doesn't mean that this is language. You hear a beautiful concerto and you pull out the plug, radio is silent, doesn't mean that the radio is a concerto. So many things that we have to learn about how genes work. But I'm really hopeful that in addition to language, cognition, neuroscience, brain, words, way back there is the genetic blueprint that made all this possible. And once we reach that stage, then we will be a very, very impressive species.
I just add note to what Professor Wang just said regarding the relationship between FOXP2 and the language. The media, not only the media sort of wrongly or broadly interpret, but even linguists such as Chomsky and Borg, when they write in their articles, they also specifically point to FOXP2 as a language gene. And this was an anecdote to this because a few years ago, when I was editor of the journal Neurolinguistics, there was a special issue in which Chomsky and Borg wrote an article and making this point. And then Simon Fisher actually wrote to me saying, that's totally wrong. He himself doesn't think that FOXP2 is a language gene. It's just one of the genes that may be important or that play an important role in determining or influencing whether you have or not have language disorder. So this is very important for everybody, including the students, to know that there is no one-to-one relationship between one gene and language behavior. Thank you.
Okay, maybe 1 minute for, great, one question,
Thank you for the talk. I have a small question. In the first learning acquisition, the prosody information and the pitch information were acquired so early. But for the second learners, they were almost the most difficult part to be acquired, I think. So my question is, what's the possible reasons for the early acquisition of porosity and pitch acquisition, but for the late acquisition for the second and third acquisition. Yeah, porosity acquisition.
There are probably several reasons why porosity has a special role in language acquisition. As I said earlier, the baby, the fetus inside, is hearing all the speech, but there's a lot of filtering through hearing just the low frequencies. And if you take speech and filter out, let's say, everything above 400 or 500 hertz, that you hear, which is the process. And it's very easy to learn at the beginning because it requires essentially just the laryngeal control without needing to synchronize it to movements of the palate and the tongue and the jaw. So segmentals come much later. Especially segmentals like the liquid consonant L and R typically come very late in all languages. And because it requires a type of fine control. L is called the lateral. Why is it called the lateral? Because the front path of the exiting air is blocked by the tongue tip. Then one side of the tongue is lowered to allow the air to come out. This is harder, much harder than making the pitch go higher or pitch go lower.
One last question.
Thank you, Professor, for the lecture. I have a more detailed question. As to the tone study, you have mentioned that the researchers researched the tone by baby crying features. So I wonder, what is the age of those infants? I mean, if the infant's age is very early, does it indicate the possibility that the baby start studying tone from its fetus stage?
I don't know very much about the subject matter in depth. I hope you have a chance to approach Professor Tom, who's following up on this work. I don't think our knowledge in this area has gotten very detailed, only very, very approximate. For instance, the initial study by Mountain reported data in biology, contrasted German and French. It's well known, aside from sentence processing, even word stress is quite different in these two languages. Take the word linguistics. In French, is linguistique, stresses on the last syllable. In German, is Sprachwissenschaft, stress on the person. Lots of words like this. So the baby is hearing all this, and as we saw, babies have a tendency to imitate. So it hears these prosodic patterns, it's trying to imitate this prosodic pattern. That would be a very simple-minded way of looking at it. Professor Zhang will surely be able to speak much more learnedly about it.
I think you can all agree with me that Professor Wang's lecture is not 抛砖引玉, it's really 抛玉引玉, right? Throughout jade, in anticipation for more jade. He has taken us through a great journey of both the phylogeny and ontogeny of the human life, covering many grounds. And also, I think he carried down the lecturing tradition studied by Professor Zhao Yuanren, that is to deliver intellectually rich and deep content in a very kind of vernacular way, a very intelligible, easy to understand way. So for that, I think Professor Wang's lecture has set a great beginning for the whole summer school program. So please join me in thanking Professor Wang again